So Paul and Jennifer used to live in San Francisco, and I said, well, when you come in, we'll make sure and figure out we can do it in the weekend when the fog and the bluster has blown back in to remind you what it used to be like. I always say that Friday the 13th is a lucky day for me, and it is particularly because we get to have Paul Collins come and talk to us tonight. So give him a round of applause. So there's some, I put a little biography together, and of course I didn't have you edit it or proofread or anything ahead of time, but just as an overview and to understand a little bit more about what we're going to talk about tonight, he is a writer specializing in history, memoir, and unusual antiquarian literature. His 7 books have been translated into 11 languages and include Not Even Wrong, A Father's Journey into the Lost History of Autism, and The Murder of the Century, the Gilded Age crime that scandalized a city and sparked the tabloid wars. He is a 2009 recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction. So in addition to also being a regular on NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday, he lives in Portland, Oregon, where he teaches creative nonfiction and is an associate professor in the MFA program in creative writing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Very good. So the first question that I had was just to sort of, and I think as much for me as everybody else, what the heck is a literary historian?
Yeah, it's sort of a job title I essentially made up for myself, I guess. For me, it really began. I was an English major in college, and in some ways, I often trace my interest in literary history. It's one that I've kind of always had, but it kind of crystallized for me when I was a work-study student. And I was assigned to work for a professor and this is like 1990, I guess. So it was just before all this stuff was starting to get digitized and so forth. He wanted an index of all the articles that had been run in all these various 19th century periodicals. So he said, I want you to go to the library. This is at William & Mary. He said, I want you to go to the library and photocopy the table of contents of like every issue from the 1850s, 60s, 70s, of Harper's, of The Atlantic, of Southern Literary Messenger. There's a whole bunch of magazines he wanted me to do. And they had all these, in print in these big volumes at the library. And so I went there, grabbed a stack of the stuff, dragged them over to a photocopier, and I started reading them instead of photocopying. I just started paging through them. I was like, wow, this is awesome. And it was actually an alarming experience too, because I'd taken all these English classes and done well in them and thought I kind of knew my stuff, thought I was sort of going to be focusing on 19th century American or something like that. And then I was reading through these issues of Harper's and things like that from the 1860s and 70s and realizing that I didn't recognize any of the names. Like every once in a while, they'd be like, oh, Herman Melville. I'd like recognize something. But what dawned on me was that I had a literary understanding of that era. And even more broadly speaking, just a historical understanding of the era that was like a greatest hits kind of understanding. It was from reading anthologies and things like that, which are useful tools, but they're just picking the canonical authors and the people that we pay attention to now because we feel that they're important now. And the writers that we find worthwhile now are not necessarily the ones that people back then thought were going to be their literary worlds. Some of them are the same, but a lot of them aren't. And so that it was kind of a shock to me to be reading through the original magazines and not recognizing so much of this stuff. And that's really one of the things that got me started in just going back to that kind of primary sourcing and trying to find more of the context of the era and more of who are the people that have been forgotten, who are the people that might have been familiar to readers back then that we just don't know about now. And also, in turn, by understanding that, you can also better understand how does Hawthorne or Melville or Dickinson or whoever come about in the first place. So that's sort of what got me started. In a way, that just gave me a giant excuse to read whatever I wanted.
Yeah. Great. part of the reason that we're here tonight is because of this book, this beautiful book that our cast members have all been given a copy of, our design team as well. I just got an autographed copy. And the subject, and for why a number of our colleagues are here, and people in the community who work with autistic children. And just as an introduction, a friend of mine this summer and colleague, their 3-year-old was diagnosed on the spectrum. And he wrote me an email the other day, and they're in the UK, and he really wanted to be here, and he's actually quite taken with this project now, obviously for certain selfish reasons. And he wrote me this saying, we're on a journey with an uncertain itinerary. As our nursery manager, who has a boy with Asperger's, said, it's like getting ready for a big holiday in Italy. You make reservations, you pack for sunny climes, you go to the airport, you take off, and you land in Holland. Welcome to Holland, says the flight attendant. Holland, you say, but we're going to Italy. Apparently, there has been a change of plan. So after the initial shock and disappointment wear off, you begin to realize that Holland has its own charms. And soon you are ready to say, who needs Italy? I wouldn't give up Holland for anything, so welcome to Holland. And I thought, in terms of context of this beautiful book that you've written, welcome to Holland. And so I wanted to start off by asking you a little bit more about the people in your life. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about your parents? I know you have a brother, and maybe some of the family. You talk a little bit about it in the book as far as how you started looking at your family slightly different when Morgan was beginning to go through this diagnosis process.
Yeah, it's interesting what your friend was describing. I think the strange thing about it is that sooner or later every parent winds up in Holland. Is that if you have a child that's been diagnosed with autism, it makes you go to Holland that much sooner, in the sense that you suddenly have to acknowledge, or you have to come to grips with them not necessarily being the person that you somehow thought or assumed they were, or imagined they were going to be, or that you have to start, in effect, engaging with them on their own terms. And in a way, all parents have to do that eventually. But usually it's adolescence, early adulthood, 30s, 40s, that you run into that, where they, at some point, there's that realization for a parent that, I do have a formative influence over my child, but they are their own person. And there are going to be aspects of them that you couldn't have predicted at all, and that you maybe had some role in forming, but it almost feels random. It's just them becoming who they are. And it's that acceptance of that is a big transition, I think, for a lot of parents. And with autism, it just happens much earlier. So, and in a different way, but it's I think, not dissimilar in that regard. I think for, as far as my own family, we're a very loosely knit family. Not my family. My wife and kids were extremely tightly knit, but my parents and my brother, it's a very weird family in a way. So my mom and my dad both met in the U.S. after having moved from Britain. So they'd moved independently from Britain, kind of were hanging out in the same group of immigrants in New York, and met each other. And so they were both very distant from their families, and like a lot of immigrants, had kind of come here to, partly out of economic opportunity and just to reinvent themselves as much as anything. And that's what my brother and I proceeded to do. We then grew up. My brother partly grew up in a different marriage in Britain and then moved to the U.S. I grew up in this tiny little town in Pennsylvania, and we both did the same thing, which was as soon as we could go to college, we went as far away as we could. So I went to college for undergrad in California. And I think, as did he, and I think it was a very similar process. We just wanted to get away from that initial set of influences and become our own people. So that's certainly been running through our family for some time now. None of us have stayed put, basically. But I think the other thing is that my dad was an engineer. My brother is a perpetual grad student. He's just finishing up his second PhD. He's got a PhD in computer science, and he's now doing one. He keeps trying to explain to me what he's working on, and I can't figure it out. It is a relation of sort of basically the use of robotics and kind of physiology and the application of computer science to that. And he's back in Britain doing that now. And yeah, I think with all of this, there's been sort of if there's been a defining characteristic, it's been concentration. Aside from just that moving and reinventing, it's that we focus on stuff. Often to a degree that it's hard to shake us out of things. And that to me was maybe the first hint that I had once I started thinking about it, that my son's condition was not some random thing that had fallen out of the sky, that there might at least be some relation between what I was seeing in my son and the rest of my family too.
Mm-hmm. Does your brother have children?
No, he's, and I don't think he would take it amiss if I said this, he's a pretty singular guy in many ways. And just, intensely talented, and very much has to work on his own. He likes being his own boss. He does not like working for other people.
Well, there's something about autism, what I've been learning these last, I've been working on it now off and on for about 2 years, that there's a singularity to many people wherever they happen to fall on the spectrum. And that, you told a funny story. In the play and in the book, we find out a lot more about Paul's family, and there's that wonderful joke about, I think, Emily, you have one about the engineer. What's the difference between an engineer and an architect or something? And so I guess my question is more, before Morgan's diagnosis, were you at all ever thinking, or is this like, oh, these are the Collins and this is who we are?
Yeah, I never really gave it much thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way that most people would, you just sort of, it's just their personality. And I didn't connect it with anything else. And I mean, the strange thing is that I had spent a year in special ed as a kid. And the school kind of didn't know what to do with me, basically, which was that, and it was an experience. It was a year that I'd never been able to quite figure out what it meant, because I'd been doing really well in school academically, and yet there was this 1 year that I knew I was in a different classroom, and that everyone was a lot nicer to me, and things seemed to go suddenly much better, and then I was thrown back into dealing with people again. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, what I found was that they thought I had hearing problems, but they kept testing me and finding that my hearing was actually really good. And they kind of didn't know what to make of that. And I mean, now that would just be called an issue of auditory processing. It's not a physical issue with my hearing. It's just how I'm actually processing it. But I'd never connected that to anything. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of parents, and a lot of people, for that matter, who maybe as adults get diagnosed. That they don't get diagnosed as children, but maybe are now in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and especially where the broader kind of spectrum of autism was not being recognized in earlier decades. That you retrospectively kind of start seeing some of those connections, but I don't think you necessarily go around thinking,
yeah.
It's one of those things that only starts to become apparent after the fact, I guess.
Sure. We were just talking over dinner, and I kind of like to contextualize a little bit for everybody what was happening at the time that Paul and his wife Jennifer took their son Morgan in for a routine checkup. Now, we all know because we have a scene in the play, and it's actually talked about in the book as well, but you were talking a little bit about what was going on in your life and what you were writing and how these things kind of collided.
Yeah, so we'd actually been living here in San Francisco over on Cole and Waller up until 2000. And at that point, my writing was just getting to the point where I could actually effectively write full time, which is always this amazing moment, I think, for any artist, when you're doing something and you perpetually have a day job to do your art, and then you have that day when you realize, oh, actually, it makes more sense for me just to do my art now, and I can quit the day job. And that's, I hit that point then, but we were going to have to move. I couldn't do that and still be living in San Francisco. And so we initially tried moving to the Welsh countryside. There's this town called Hay on Wye. It's right on the Welsh-English border, and it's known as the town of books. It's about 1,400 people. And at that time, at least, there were 41 bookstores in the town. So that was the town industry. It was all antiquarian booksellers. And it built up around this guy named Richard Booth. He had bought a castle in the middle of the town and just started filling it up with old books on the assumption that this would somehow create a gravitational pull that would suck people in. And he was right.
It did for you.
It did.
Yeah.
So it was this strange little town because it was full of kind of bookish people, basically. And I thought, that's the place for me. And so we tried moving there, and it kind of didn't work. We were never able to find a place to live, basically, that we wanted to stay in. And at some point, I think we just got homesick. But we didn't really have a plan B. So, but we visited Portland, liked it. We'd also been in Oregon in general, so we moved to Eugene for a little while, then moved up to Portland.
But Oregon was born here.
Oregon was born here in San
Before you
Francisco.
went to Wales.
And he was about a year and a half old when we left. And eventually we wound up about a year later in Portland. And so at first I wrote a memoir called Sixpence House about that experience of trying to move to Wales. And it was in some ways kind of your usual comic memoir of trying to move to another country and being incompetent at it. And it was just coming off of that. I had just finished that book a few weeks earlier when we took Morgan to that doctor's appointment. And so, yeah, and I just sort of been starting working on what I figured was going to be my next book on Peter the Wild Boy, who I had come across while living in Hay. And that was just one of those things where at the time I didn't connect Peter as a figure with anything going on in my life. He seemed like an interesting figure. And then as Morgan's diagnosis started to emerge, I just had this weird moment, which is actually in the book, where I realized that, that what I'd been fascinated by, at least at some level, was actually pretty directly connected to my own life.
Where the scene in the book and also in the play of being in the doctor's office, but that first moment where it was a female doctor?
Yeah, Amy Winland. Yeah.
Where she said...
We're still in touch with her, too.
Oh,
yeah.
Where she says, I think you need to have him tested. What can you describe a little bit about what that must have felt like? Or
irritation, disbelief, annoyance. That, what are you saying about my child? It was, and I think it's an experience that probably a lot of parents have. I think maybe especially if it's your first child. And I often wonder about this, which is that I have a younger son now as well. And so we've watched him progress through a lot of the typical developmental landmarks that you would expect a child to have. And I sometimes think that if Morgan had been a second child, we would have noticed this stuff earlier. We might have clued in that something was up. But not only had we no previous experience as parents, but we'd been moving around a lot. So we weren't hanging around with the same group of friends and watching their kids develop at the same time.
Nothing to compare it to.
Exactly. And, that is always a difficult thing with parenting, which is there's no manual, You're sort of inventing it as you go along. And to the extent that you have guidance, it's often coming from, we got What to Expect When You're Expecting, and we had a whole stack of parenting books, but we didn't have any other experience to draw on. We didn't have that much experience of our peers to draw on either. And I think, had that been the case, I don't know if we would have figured it out any earlier. We might have been less surprised, I think. But even even given the oddness of our situation, it still seems to be the case for a lot of parents that when the doctor tells them that, they don't want to hear it. And we've actually had the same experience. We have had friends have kids, and we've met their kid, year and a half, 2 years old, watch them playing, watch how they interact, and I'll say, they're on the spectrum. And this has happened a few times now. And the first time it happened, we very gently, we thought, diplomatically tried to bring up the idea with this friend of ours, and she did not want to hear it. Did not want to hear it at all. And then, I don't know, and we actually repeatedly kind of bugged her about it, and she didn't want to know. And then it was the same thing. 6-7 months later, she was at a doctor's appointment. The doctor brought it up. And even then, it took months before she would engage with it at all, because it was sort of the same reaction. It was just a disbelief, I think.
We have people in this room who not only have been through what Paul is describing, but also have been on the other side of that and helping to and working with the diagnosis process. You say in the book, autism entails both disability and ability. Isolating difficulties with human relationship, for example, can be the flip side of a fierce aptitude for logic and a capacity for intense independent focus. You talked about this a second ago. These personality traits run through families and society and underpin fields like engineering, art, and science. And from this podcast that I have encouraged my cast and production team to listen to, because it's just wonderful. It's both you and Jennifer. And Paul's wife, Jennifer, says in describing autism, it's often explained to people who aren't familiar with it that an autistic child is like somebody watching a video and you're trying to get their attention. But at the worst, they don't hear you at all, or at best, you're sort of bugging them, and then they try to swat you away. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of Morgan's behavior in that time, especially once, I hate to use the word label, but once that diagnosis was crystallized for you and Jennifer, what were some of the behaviors that you observed in him?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think actually your point about label is an important one, because especially as a writer, words have meaning, and I've had this weird experience. We've been traveling a little bit with Morgan, which is a huge nerve-wracking production, and so and it's been very worth it, but it's also very anxiety-producing. And we've actually put a label on it. Literally, he's got a label on his back. It says, hi, my name is Morgan Collins, I have autism. If I'm wondering, without a parent or guardian, there's all our phone numbers and everything, because like a lot of autistic kids, especially in mid and kind of more severe parts of the spectrum, he'll wander off. And he doesn't have a good sense of danger or anything like that. If you ask him, who are you? Are you looking for something? He's not going to respond to you, basically. And so we had this weird moment where we were like, and we've got like a phone that we can, has tracking on it and all that kind of stuff. But do we actually put a label on his back in case he gets lost? We haven't lost him for 7 years. He slipped out of the house one time, and it was terrifying. And it's something that a lot of parents deal with at some point. They just, your back is turned from running, they run off. And so we had that weird moment where we're like, this is who he is, and we have to be watching out for him. And so we do label him in a literal sense in that situation. And yeah, as far as his behaviors at that age, it's weird. Coming down here, I reread the book, which I haven't done in a long time because, strange as this sounds, I'm not in the habit of reading my own books. Once I've finished them, it's like I move on to the next thing, and it's just, I almost don't want to think about it for at least a few years afterwards. But now I'm at the happy point where it's been long enough I can read it and be like, oh, okay. I can almost read it like it's someone else's book. But the strange thing is that reading it, I'm reminded of how much of the behavior is the same between then and now. I mean, some of it has changed, but he does often seem to be in his own world, or his attention is very, it's very uneven. You know, sometimes you have his absolute full attention, quite literally in the sense that he will grab your head and pull you up to his face, and really wants your attention. And other times you're really trying to get his attention, so you're trying to walk him through something, and he's focused on something else altogether. But I think the other thing too is that even a lot of the physical cues are the same.
Like what? Can you give us an example?
A lot of them are things that, when we go to classrooms of autistic children, we'll see these in other kids too. Hand flapping is a really common thing, rocking back and forth. Frog jumping, strangely enough, is not one I hear described that often, but I see it in other kids. With Morgan, if he's happy, he starts to do these frog jumps. And I should mention now that Morgan is 14 now. He's as tall as I am. He's taller than Jennifer now. And so when he jumps, the whole house hears it. So he's a big guy, and so it's if I hear these boom, boom, boom
He's
through the
happy.
house, I know he's happy.
Great.
So yeah.
I have a few more questions, and I actually would like to open up to you all, because I know some of you have questions you want to ask Paul, or things that we can talk about. You told me a story. No, I'm sorry. I'm gonna go to this because I think it's. Temple Grandin says that because I have autism, I live by concrete rules instead of abstract beliefs. And because I have autism, I think in pictures and sounds. I don't have the ability to process abstract thought the way you do. So we were talking a little bit about that over dinner, and I'm wondering if you can maybe, as best as anyone can, give us a glimpse into what you think, or maybe you and Jennifer think, Morgan's thought process might be.
I mean, it's hard because in some ways we have to guess at it.
Right.
Because the way he uses language it tends to be pretty much instrumental. He wants something as I want this, or actually a lot of times he still mixes up pronouns. So you want the iPad? It's a fairly common request. Things like that. So he'll use language in that way, but he doesn't do small talk. He doesn't, or he will, but it's sort of scripting, where he's got long stretches of things like there's all kinds of stuff actually, dialogues from like Sesame Street, Bear in a Big Little House, musical instruction videos that he really likes, things like that he'll just repeat, and it's often hard to make rhyme or reason of what he's doing when he does that. Although a lot of the time it's associative. He sees something, and a word or an aspect of it will then link to something that is associated or is indirectly connected with that in his mind, and he just starts scripting through that. His thought process in that sense is often associative. He's linking things. But as far as sort of abstract thought, it's really hard to get a bead on what he makes of things like that. And I think for us, the big landmark there was, I guess, probably at about 5 or 6 years of age. Because initially, when I was writing the book, I really didn't know how he was going to develop. At the beginning of the book, it's just before he's turned 3. And once he got to 5 or 6 years, and we started seeing some of his classmates and some of his peers starting to really work more in terms of thinking about abstractions and things like that, and he wasn't developing that way at all. So things like the idea of a country or money. Money means nothing to him that I can tell. It just it has never seemed to register in any way. A lot of stuff like that. It may mean something to me. If it does, I haven't been able to figure it out. And so one of the strange things that I've wound up seeing is that for Morgan, who's in that sense is very squarely in the middle of this sort of the spectrum, or maybe going towards the more severe part of the autism spectrum. By no means profoundly so. It is a lot like Jennifer's description that it's like he's watching his own movie and you're kind of, to some degree, interrupting him.
Right.
He does engage with us and with other people, but it's very much on his own terms. I have noticed with a lot of higher functioning kids on the spectrum with Asperger's and things like that, it's not quite the same thing. That is where it's more like they're actually very aware of social interactions. They're very aware of abstractions in many cases. But they don't necessarily know how they're supposed to handle it, or it's not as obvious. They really have to work harder to figure out how to handle those interactions. But they're often intensely aware of them, and sometimes painfully so. And in a strange way, Morgan is not. He just it kind of doesn't register with him.
Did you find, one last follow-up, and then I want to open up to you guys, and that is, did you find that in researching Peter that what you just said was almost a direct parallel? Because I think depending on who you read, he really only spoke a few words his entire life. He knew his name, and I think he knew George or King, and that was about it. Did you find, again, going back to these two stories, that there was something?
Very much so, and I think that, as I was writing the book, one of the things that I wound up getting really interested in was the role of high-functioning autism and how it plays out, like when I was visiting Microsoft and places like that. It's very, and there's something very narratively compelling about it. And it also resonates on a certain level, like how do these sort of, you can almost say kind of almost neurological subcultures develop within a society. And that was something that really fascinated me. I'm not sure if I would, if I write a follow-up book some distant day, I'm probably going to focus more on Morgan's part of the spectrum. And I think most writers focus more on the high-functioning end. They focus on the savants, on the Bill Gates of the world, because it makes for a good story.
Sure. But Jennifer's books, her wonderful book, Like Me, An Autistic Planet, and she's actually writing about some of these people that I had never even considered until I read those.
Right, and it's that it makes for a good story, and it's also that it's an important story. That this is actually part and parcel of how our culture develops too. But at the same time, I've become much more keenly aware of, over the years, of autistic adults, for one thing, which is very much on my mind as Morgan is getting older, and people with autism who are much more on the middle of the spectrum or on the more severe parts of the spectrum. They don't get written about as much, and it's a lifelong commitment that the parent and the family has as to how are they going to live their lives. And so it's harder to write about, frankly. But I think that is something that I've been thinking about a lot more. And at dinner, we were talking a little bit about, I just got an email recently, and I wish I could remember his name. I'm sure it'll come to me later. A guy in London who had just read the book, actually, and wanted to email me. He's like 85, 86, and his son, when his son was initially going into the public school system in London in like the late 50s, with autism, and the school system at that time, they essentially said put him in an institution. They didn't want to deal with it at all. And in fact, the prevailing thinking at that time was that was actually the best setting for the child. You take him away from the parent, and his father was very insistent that he was not going to do this. And in effect, along with a few other parents, set up kind of one of the prototype autism classrooms in Britain, one of the first ones there. So it's an interesting story in and of himself. But the other thing is, he's like 86 now. He's 85, 86, and his son is retirement age, and he's still taking care of him. And that to me, I always have this in the back of my mind, but that to me embodied one of the real challenges of this, which is, I'm always going to be taking care of Morgan, and and that's not something. It's something I touched on barely in the book, but it certainly comes more to mind now as I get older. And I will add this, by the way. It's a rough read emotionally, but there's a book that Carl Terrell Greenfield did a few years ago called Boy Alone, which is about the experience of growing up as the brother of a more severely autistic brother, more so than Morgan. And his father had actually written a number of books about their son. And his experience of that and his experience of his brother going into adulthood. It's a harrowing book, but I think I'm glad he wrote it. I'm glad he wrote it because it's one of those things that it needs to be written about.
And what's it called again?
Boy Alone.
Boy Alone.
Yeah.
And talking about this, the last thing I'll say is that it makes me think about Peter, because King George first died so suddenly, and here for just a short year or two, he was the wonder of wonders. It was all the excitement of the 1720s in Georgian London, and then when George died and Caroline kind of took over that mantle of, we're going to care for this boy now. And that boy became a man and ended up being cared for until he died in 1785. Outlived all of these people who had originally, during the Age of Enlightenment, had kind of said, oh, we're going to examine this wild boy. And I sort of joked to you that I'd love to see a story about that as well, because I find that fascinating, how he was able to move on. But going back to our story and to this wonderful book, who has a question here for Paul? So, Emma, what do you got?
Actually, it was funny that you were just talking about that book, because I was going to ask what the dynamic between your younger son and Morgan is now.
Yeah, so I have a younger son, Bramwell, who's 9 now, and so at the end of Not Even Wrong, we're sort of just talking like, are we going to have a second child? And in fact, then when the book came out was right when he was born. So in between my writing that and the book coming out, we had our younger son, and it's been really interesting because he's never known the world as anything but one in which he has an autistic brother. And so in some ways, it's a very normal situation to him. Morgan just is who he is. It's been interesting to watch, and it's been interesting to watch with other parents that we know that also have siblings, particularly younger siblings, where there isn't an adjustment process per se, because they've always known their brother or sister to be that way. One of the things, so I think it was very good for Morgan, because as is the divine right of younger siblings everywhere, Bramwell is in his face all the time. He's pestering him all the time. And I say this as a younger brother myself. I did the same thing. And I think that was actually good for Morgan. After Bram was born, we brought him home, and pretty cautious, we were showing him to Morgan, it's your little brother, and he kind of thought of it. They said, take him back. It's not going to happen. So there's been that dynamic, but I think it was really good for Morgan because he had someone that would not be told no, that wanted to interact with him, and that another thing that we've really had to grapple with is in raising Bram, we want him to also be his own person, have his own life, and it's difficult on siblings because I think it's probably true with any disability that you necessarily, in some ways, have to prioritize the child with a disability. We always have to have an eye on Morgan. We can't, we can't not have an eye on him at any time, and that means I'll be in the middle of doing something with Bram, and then I have to get up and run, and he's never known a time when that hasn't been the case. It's meant that we really have to make a point specifically of creating time that is just for him. And he knows, and I think, I hope has kind of come to understand, we're never going to be able to be in a place where that can even be much of the time, or certainly most of the time, but we really try to make time that is just his for that reason. So that's certainly something we've had to kind of grapple with. But the other interesting thing that's come up between the two of them, I think, is that Graham was intensely protective of Morgan in the way that older siblings usually are. He has had to step into that older brother kind of role in a way, which meant as he developed, he became very bossy. And I've seen that over and over again with siblings for other autistic kids too. And in some ways we've tried to mitigate that a bit. We don't want him to be bossy with everybody, but it's a strange kind of balancing act. We want him to be concerned for his brother. We want him to be looking out a bit for his brother. By the same token, we want him to have his own life. There's going to be a time when he hits adulthood. He may want to move across the country to go to college, and he might not want to come back. He might want to live in another country, and we'll be old by then, or at least older. And at some point, and this happens in any family, there's going to be that decision of to what degree is he going to be involved in his brother's life? How close is he going to be, literally and figuratively to his brother? And I'm glad that he cares as much as he does about his brother, and I hope that very much stays with him. By the same token, I don't want him to have to carry the weight of it on his shoulders all the time, because it's not fair to a person. They need to be able to develop as their own person too, and that's the big challenge, I think, always with siblings.
Yeah.
When and how did you have the conversation with Morgan about being diagnosed?
That's a good question. We don't really have conversations with Morgan. We talk with him all the time, and he talks with us all the time, but they're not what you would call conversations in the normal sense of the word. He scripts a lot, and sometimes I can figure out what the scripts are about, just the repeating stuff. Other times I really have no idea. And in fact, one of the strange things, and I don't know if this is good parenting or not, but if he'll run through a long script and then look at you like he wants you to respond, and it's like something that I have no idea what the hell he's been talking about, because he's just done a long script from some random thing, and I'll just go, "That's right," because if I don't, he'll have a meltdown. So it's that must make for a pretty weird conversational dynamic for anyone watching. At other times, he actually will make very instrumental use of language, and it's he wants something or he's upset about something, and will express that. And other times he will observe something. He'll point something out in the sense of musical instruments, especially anything musical. He'll notice and he'll mention it, or he'll mention the instrumentation, or he'll compare it to something else. But in the sense of having like a dialogic kind of relation, it doesn't really happen, and it has never happened. For us, the big breakthrough, and it's in the book too, is when we were finally able to come up with a way of asking him questions, written questions, because we hadn't really been able to work out doing spoken ones with him. And in some ways, it's become more nuanced and subtle and a bit more complex since then. But that fundamental dynamic has never changed. He's never started to make small talk with us or something like that. It kind of isn't there. So yeah, it's strange because in a sense, I don't know if he knows that he's autistic. I don't know if he knows that he's different. He might. I honestly don't know. Whereas with people who are on the higher functioning end of the spectrum, they can be not only very aware of that fact, but sometimes painfully so. And it's actually a real problem with grappling how do they work out this relation to other people, given the way that they are. But he's he's so much in his own world in some ways that I honestly don't know. I do know that he gets very frustrated sometimes, but sometimes it's just because I can't get the Wi-Fi signal right from the house, so it's hard to tell sometimes.
Here's another question. Yeah, please.
This is actually a long one. If you had the opportunity to produce the story, let's say for a film, would you take your book as a script, or would you take Oliver's novel?
I'd probably take Oliver's. One thing that and this actually came up as Oliver was developing the early drafts of the play, was that he'd sent something to me for comments, which was very kind of him. And I'd actually become, I think, really keenly aware. Well, let me backtrack actually a little on this. One of the things as a writing instructor that I'm always telling my students to do is, I'll put in a plug for your program here, I always told them to take playwriting or screenwriting classes because it forces them to think in scenes and it forces them to learn dialogue because you have nothing else to hide behind in those formats. And that was true for me. In my early 20s, I wrote a couple of screenplays that went straight into my desk, never to reemerge. But it was one of the best things I ever did for myself as a writer. And in doing that, it made me keenly aware of the differences between the forms. And it's funny because not long ago, I was doing an article about F. Scott Fitzgerald and his ill-fated attempts at writing screenplays for Hollywood. And if you ever read one of Fitzgerald's screenplays, it is a novelist trying to write a screenplay. He has these long descriptions of the expression that an actor is supposed to have on their face, and you can just see in your mind's eye the director going, "What is this? Let the actors act." And it really drove home for me, especially reading Fitzgerald stuff, that it's a different format, and it's one that. I think for something like that, it really does just come down to having someone that understands working in that format, and Oliver does. Most of my comments to him when we were actually doing some back and forth on his drafts were really just on the technical stuff. Literally like saying, well, a special ed teacher wouldn't say that, or the social worker wouldn't have, they would use this acronym, or that kind of thing. It was just the nitpicking the things that might be jarring to those from people from those fields in the audience. But as far as like the narrative arc or the scenes or something like that, he knows his stuff on that. Yeah.
There's another question. Yeah, Lauren.
So working on this play and getting to know Morgan's story, and I'm playing Jennifer, and Jennifer's part of the story. It's really made me self-analyze my own dynamic and my dynamic with my family. And when you were telling your story about spending a year in special ed, I remembered that in 5th grade, I'm diagnosed with learning disabilities. I should practice this. But in 5th grade, my 5th grade teacher sat down with me and my mom, who was a single mother at the time, and said, "I think when your daughter goes to middle school, she should be in special ed." And I remember thinking as a kid, awesome. And my mom, on the other hand, kind of freaked out and got very upset at this teacher and told her never call me in for something like this again, and we never spoke about it. And I wasn't diagnosed until about my junior and senior year of high school, and that was actually a curse for me. Because being in public schools with learning disabilities was extremely challenging, especially when I was younger. When I was really young, elementary school was the worst. And then it would get a little bit better as I got older. But, after really just this story about Morgan, I keep thinking to myself, if I had been diagnosed as a child, that would have been a blessing. And I want to know from you, do you see it now? I know that hearing it at first must have been terrifying, because my mom was obviously like, I don't want to hear anything about this. No, my daughter's fine. And I'm sure it was the same for you and Jennifer, but now, do you see it as a blessing? Do you see it any differently, especially with how Morgan learns or interacts in like a school environment?
It's interesting. So I think in Morgan's case, I see it as inevitable. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a matter of if, it's when. Because if you meet Morgan, it's apparent within seconds that he's different. Just from his physical gestures and his vocalizations and things like that. It's something that if we hadn't been told then, we would have been told the next time we went to the doctor or something like that. So we were going to find out sooner or later whether we realized it or not at the time. But in the process, we've met a lot. I mean, we know a lot of parents that have kids with learning disabilities and things like that are more subtle and less obvious from the outset. And I think for most of them, it's really been a good thing. And it's a real debate too within the field itself, within school systems, because among other things, of course, that's more expense for a school system. And so there's this question of, are these things being overdiagnosed? What about the financial strain it puts on the system, et cetera, et cetera? Are you somehow changing the child's own expectations? And I think it's a complicated issue, but I will say this: most of the people that I know that wind up being diagnosed with these things in adulthood, their reaction has often been, I wish I'd known this earlier. And in many cases, especially with high functioning autism or something like that, where you could go, in some cases, a lifetime without knowing, their reaction a lot of time is kind of, this only does me a limited amount of good now. It's interesting to know this about myself. It would have actually been extremely helpful in some ways to know about this earlier. And I think a lot of it does come down to the stuff that you're mentioning too, especially in one's early years at school, where things are being ascribed to the motives of the child or to their behavior or something like that. That the instructors and the staff might be better able to work with if they knew. So I think it's generally a good thing.
The other thing I'll follow up with is that the thing I've learned, Oliver and I talked about this about a year ago. It's interesting that this book was written, you wrote it in 04 or 03?
Wrote it in 03, not 04.
That if this experience had happened to Paul and Jennifer 40 years ago, 9 times out of 10, Morgan probably would have been institutionalized. And so the thing that I have learned, one of the advantages, and I think you even alluded to this in the podcast, of being diagnosed in the 21st century, actually there's such a wonderful push for early intervention. And I, as far as I'm an outsider, but having learned that again, it's a complicated issue, but I'm all for that. At least that's what I'm learning. Yeah, let me get a question.
Well, I'm just going to follow up on this question a little bit. In the book, you really do take us into sort of how both you and Jennifer sort of make the journey together and separately. And I think the play, in some ways, really is Paul's story, right? It's really how Paul comes to terms with what's going on. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit more about sort of your separate journeys as parents, and to the degree that you feel comfortable, sort of the impact on your relationship of having.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's funny when you're mentioning this. This makes me think of we once met. I want to say 4 or 5 years ago with some professors, I think from LaSalle University, that were coming through Portland for some conference. They were like administrators at LaSalle, and I think I'm remembering the university correctly. And they really wanted to meet us, and so we met them for coffee, and it turned out it was because they were at a Catholic university. They were setting up an autism program, and one of their big concerns was the divorce rate in families with autism. And there's, being a Catholic institution, this is a matter of particular concern to us. What do you think we should do? And I think almost the first answer that came out of our mouths just about simultaneously was respite care. But it was one of the things that I found myself thinking about with that was that and this is probably true of, I think, of a lot of disabilities, that an autism diagnosis, I think, often acts as an accelerant in a relationship. In other words, if you had a relationship that was tending to kind of bond more tightly to begin with, it presses you together that much harder. If there were already kind of incipient cracks in the relationship, it's hard to know. Maybe it's one that it would have survived that, but it forces it that much faster, and I think it has the potential to split a shaky relationship apart that much faster. And so for us, it really did have that effect of, we were pretty tight already, but it made us all that much more so. Particularly because we were really having to advocate for our child, as any parent has to, but it was that much more keenly felt, I think. So that for us was a big part of it. And I have to say, we've been, and of course he's in the book and the play as well, we're incredibly fortunate to have Mark. Mark has known Morgan since the day he was born, and has known Jennifer since they were both in college. And so we have someone that we completely trust, who has known Morgan all his life, and who is, even before the diagnosis, was actually working as a nanny for afternoons, basically, so that I had time to write, she had time to paint, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been a huge help. Mark's presence is a huge help, and we're very lucky in that regard because most people don't have an Uncle Mark. But if you have someone like that, or extended family or something like that can step into that role, I think it makes a huge difference. Which I guess maybe goes back to the comment that I made to LaSalle people, which was for parents that don't have a support network like that, having that breathing space for a few hours a day sometimes, or even once a week or something like that, I think it makes a huge difference. So yeah, that's been important for us in our development, and Mark's very much a part of that too, which is one reason I'm really glad that Oliver made him a part of the play, because he's very much a part of the story in that regard.
Callie, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts about the fact that they've declassified Asperger's? They've taken that off the spectrum. Is that?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't exactly know what to make of it. One of the reactions that I noticed, and this is just my own kind of anecdotal, from what I see from other parents at my school and that kind of thing, was that some of them seemed very unhappy about it because they did not want to be associated with the more severe forms of autism, basically. And and because it often does feel like a really distinct condition in some ways. And I don't know what the effect of that's actually going to be. In some ways, it's, I think, potentially a beneficial thing. If you have a child where their condition has been linked to something that is very clearly something that demands resources, then as a parent, that actually puts you in a better position in some ways to get those resources.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, I would often see parents who were very resistant to their child being labeled as being on any kind of autism spectrum, or in fact would, in effect, almost seem to be pushing for things like, there's another, I'm going to forget what the acronym is for it, PDD, NLS, or something like that, that were pushing for something like that, that they wanted a somewhat more vague classification because they didn't want to be kind of ghettoized into autism. I understand that reaction, and it may be too as the understanding of the condition becomes more complex over time, because it does seem in some ways like there are a lot of different aspects of autism, only some of which you find in any one kid, it may turn out that it turns out to be this kind of constellation of conditions. I really don't know how the nomenclature for that's going to develop.
Well, and it's the thing about autism is it can involve mental retardation, which is like the wild boy, Peter, is probably mentally retarded in some way, right?
Well, I think that was the age of reason in saying that, or the age of enlightenment, that was he. And the truth is, because they had decided, the philosophers and the theologians and the scientists of the time were saying, without language, we're not human. Just because he didn't speak didn't necessarily mean he was retarded.
Well, but
I just want to,
they think that he had that what is the name of that?
Pitt-Hopkins syndrome.
Which is a form
It's
of
a-
mental retardation.
It is, but again, we don't know.
We don't know.
We just
I
know
mean,
they didn't speak. Well, I have a strong reaction, not only, and this isn't about me tonight, and only because that I don't know necessarily that language should be and is equated with, a retardation. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no,
It's a
and I
good question,
agree.
though, and it's
Yeah.
one I think that is often dodged to some degree in these things, which is that, with someone like Morgan, his condition is such that I think will always be taken care of, and I don't know if he's ever going to, for instance, go to college, work in a job, anything like that. And if you look at various disabilities, autism has, I think by a pretty long stretch, one of the highest rates of that being the case, where it is lifelong care and you do not have those kids going into a workplace or any kind of work program or anything like that. It's especially when you're looking at more of the middle and more severe forms of it, it's extraordinarily difficult to kind of harness their abilities in ways that one would normally assume that, we'll put them in this program and get them working in this setting, et cetera. And so I think it's important not to dodge that as an issue. That even though, for instance, even the nomenclature of retardation and things like that has been kind of changing over time, but there is no question that with someone like Morgan, there are profound issues and challenges that he faces in interacting with the world. And yet, for someone with high-functioning autism, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And so it's, it kind of comes back to your question about Asperger's, which is, what does it mean to have those two maybe conflated to some extent? And in some ways, as a practical matter, it might actually be helpful for a lot of parents. In other ways, it almost maybe muddies the issue in the sense that when I see Morgan and I see someone that's on the high end kind of the spectrum, there's also some tremendous differences in terms of the likely paths that they're going to be following educationally, professionally, et cetera, and in terms of their independence.
And I think I reacted simply because I don't want our students to think that just because someone is on the spectrum, that there is automatically a retardation.
Well,
as
no,
well.
and that's why it's like, it just seems like there are as many ways you could say that somebody's autistic as there are people.
Right.
And I look at people in my family, I'm pretty sure that one of my nephews is Asperger,
Yeah.
but I don't think his parents who are just I don't think it ever occurred to them that they should get any kind of diagnosis for him. And I think it was probably really good that they didn't, because they've always just dealt with him with a lot of patience and with who he is as a person, even though I've always wanted to slap him because he can be really difficult.
But see, that's the interesting thing is the slapping upside the head.
Well, I would never do that.
No, I know you're joking there, but it's I can think
He's
of
frustrated.
I can think of people I've run into professionally who I can think of a couple that I'm pretty sure are on the spectrum, but they're not close friends of mine. They're not close colleagues of mine. They're not people I could go to and say, "Hey, I think you have Asperger's." I can't start leaving little hints for them or something like that. And in some cases, they have very difficult relations professionally with colleagues, and it's hard to know. A, to what degree is that even my business? But B, how could I or should I even bring that up with them? Would they just be monumentally offended? Would it actually be one of those things that they're incredibly offended, then they think about it, and then maybe it helps? I have no idea. And in fact, one in particular I can think of, I think she would just be infuriated at me to no purpose whatsoever. So it's very hard to know, and I think it becomes even more difficult in that regard once someone's an adult. It kind of goes back to that earlier comment, which is that I think, particularly when someone's an adult, you to some degree get a reaction of, that's interesting to know about myself now, but it would have been really helpful to know that 30 years ago, or 20 years ago.
We had another question. Yeah, Amanda.
So, in regards to Morgan's schooling, how do you think his life and his development would be different if you guys didn't have access to early intervention?
I know actually how it would be different in some ways. So, what happened in the immediate aftermath of this book, within a couple months, this came out in like April or May or something of 2004. And at that point, Morgan had just turned 5. And so he was about to go into elementary school. And we were living in Portland at the time, as we are now. And so we went to the school. They had just gotten a new head of special education at the school. And we were told that the school was switching models and they were going to go to a full inclusion model. And so the special ed classroom was going to be eliminated and all these students were going to be put in regular classrooms. And I should preface this by saying that the debate over separate classrooms versus inclusion, or to what degree of inclusion, is one of these eternal debates within education. And there's a lot to be argued for the role of inclusion. And I've seen it, and I've seen it work well in some ways, particularly at my younger son's school. But what they were doing was using the language of inclusion for budget cuts. What they were doing was they were going to dump these students in a classroom without aides. And actually, the weird thing about, if you think of the advantages of centralizing things, in a strange way, having special classrooms is probably cheaper than properly enacting full inclusion, because with full inclusion, you have all these kids spread out over all these classrooms around the district, and they have aides following them around and stuff like that. It's probably a lot more expensive to do it properly. Portland was not going to do it properly. They were just going to dump them in the classes. And so we were at these meetings and it was weird because the book had just come out. And it was like a big story in the Oregonian and blah, blah, blah. And there are very few occasions in this life where I've actually wanted to shake my book in someone's face. Don't you know who I am? This was one of them at the school meeting. The book had just come out and they're like, yeah, he's going to be in a regular classroom. He's not going to have an aide. He'll have a 20-minute breakout session every week or something like that. It's like, and we're like, he'll run into traffic and stuff, and there's no fence around the playground. And they said something like, or I think we'd actually said, there's no fence around the playground. There's a lot of traffic nearby. And they said, oh, is that a problem? And we're like, oh, shit. And we knew he was actually going to be in physical danger in that environment. And so we had this weird moment where I was writing full-time at that time, and I thought, I've got a portable job. And so I started emailing parents, autism groups around the country, and basically saying, do you like your school? Almost along the lines of, hey, potential neighbor, how do you like your school system? And I basically needed a place that was affordable, had a good school system, and had a good research library for my own work. We wound up moving to Iowa City for a few years, which was fantastic. We froze, but the school system there was amazing. And I think in part because of the School of Education at the university, there were a lot of people doing a lot of research, a lot of, very energetic grad students in the classrooms and things like that. It was terrific. And for me, it wound up being this weird detour, because then I wound up getting a job at PSU and we moved back to Portland. I have to add, much to Jennifer's relief, because she grew up in the Bay Area. We were like stranded in the Midwest for a few years. But it was something that we kind of almost had to do. And it was that weird moment where we had this moment where we saw what might happen without really almost any kind of support for him. And then what happened when he had a lot of support. And, as challenged as he is now, I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed in the Portland system. As it turned out, there were all kinds of lawsuits filed against the school district, and they had to backpedal. But it was a frightening moment. And it was all the more frightening because it made me realize that we were the ones that actually had the ability to do that. A lot of parents couldn't. They had work, they had family. They were not in a situation where they could just say, well, to hell with you people, and move somewhere nicer, if you want to call Iowa nicer. I liked Iowa. And actually, kind of as a footnote to that, I would say, too, one thing that really struck me during the early stages when Morgan was getting diagnosed, I remember this really distinctly. When we took him to get tested, in the next room over to us, we could kind of overhear some of the staff talking to another parent with their kid. And I can't even remember what language it was, but they had to bring a translator to talk to the parent. And so it was, a second language parent. I don't know if English was even the child's first language necessarily. And I would say their kid was at least 5 or 6 at that point. And it really drove home to me, if you're, as parents, Jennifer and I are in this, in some ways, really ideal situation. I had a portable job, I have a good education, we're together as a couple. If you're a single parent, if you don't have a lot of economic resources, if you're an immigrant, if English is not your first language, I'm fortunate that Jennifer is a much more forceful personality than I am, and I have a tendency when something's going bad to just sort of go, oh, okay, and she won't take shit from anybody. So,
That's why I love it.
it's a good team in a way because I'm the one that kind of gets her to cool down. It's sort of a good cop, bad cop thing. But I'm really fortunate that we have that kind of relationship where she especially will dig her heels in, and that we have all these resources to draw on. A lot of parents don't, and it means that things like diagnosis or the ability to move around or to stand up for their child when their child needs resources is not necessarily there.
I just want to finish up with a couple of things here and then everybody, we're going to take a break. The actors have a few scenes they want to show to anybody who would like to stay around. This whole notion of, as I've been learning about autists, Hall writes, I'm just quoting him from his book, autists are described by others and by themselves as aliens among humans. But there's an irony to this, for precisely the opposite is true. They are us. And to understand them is to begin to understand what it means to be human. And I think that most of all resonated with me. And I know with Oliver and the way we have, we all have committed to this process and bringing this story to life through stage, maybe a film someday, starring Khalif Bell. And I think that I'm still learning each and every day about this, and especially for a number of the guests and the faces that I see who got to come tonight to hear Paul speak. So I just want to say thank you so much. Folks, we're going to take a little break, and anybody who would like to stick around, we're going to do a few scenes from the show so you can see what we've been working on. Please.